Good evening, everybody, and welcome. What a wonderful crowd. It's so nice to have you all here. How many of you, is this your first time at the Bank of New Hampshire stage? All right, that's wonderful. Come back often. This is an expensive building, so we have to pay for it. My name is Katie Collins. I work here at the Capitol Center in the Bank of New Hampshire stage. Excuse my phone, I have Laura's bio on it. I'm really thrilled to have this event taking place here for the second year in a row. Prior to working at the Capitol Center, I was the executive director of the New Hampshire Writers Project. So anything to do with writers in New Hampshire is incredibly near and dear to my heart. So I always say yes when Paul asks me to do anything that has to do with New Hampshire writers. So I have the wonderful task of introducing our host and our moderator this evening. And it's a little daunting because I don't know if you saw the promotional posters, but the promotional posters describe her as legendary. So I'm going to try to do my best to introduce her correctly. Our moderator tonight for the second year of this wonderful event is Laura Knoy, who many of you know. She's one of the most well-known journalists in New Hampshire, founding host of NHPR's The Exchange, which she was with for 25 years, one of the most widely recognized and respected radio programs in the state. In mid-2021, she stepped down from that position to pursue other interests, including writing fiction. Her skills in interviewing, moderating, and public speaking are frequently called upon, as they are here this evening. Laura frequently joined the Rudman Center at UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law as its Director of Community Engagement, which sounds like a great job. She's also a fitness instructor, intimidating, and a lifeguard at her local YMCA, and as an avid lap swimmer, I thank her deeply for that service. And she is the host of the podcast, Read Local New Hampshire. You're in for a real treat to have Laura here moderating this panel tonight, and you're in for a real treat with the literary talent that's going to be on this stage. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Katie. I'll look for you in the pool. Well, it's great to see everyone, and it's great to be back at the beautiful Bank of New Hampshire stage. And full disclosure, this is my favorite venue in Concord. I just love it here. It's wonderful. I really want to thank our sponsors who made this event possible, the wonderful folks at Gibson's Bookstore, Concord TV, which produces my podcast, Read Local NH, so extra thanks, guys, the Concord Public Library, the New Hampshire Writers Project, and of course, Steve Dupree and the Dupree Companies for their financial support. So thank you to them. So welcome everyone to the second annual Conversations with Concord-Area Authors. And this event fits in perfectly with the efforts that many of us Granite Staters are making already to eat local, shop local. So tonight we are really encouraging you to add Read Local to that list. Toward that end, I am so happy to be thrilled by 5 Concord area authors. We're going to talk about their books, we'll talk about their creative process, and we're going to take your questions too. So in about 30 minutes, we will look forward to hearing what you have to say. Last year, the questions were wonderful. Please, right now, while we're getting settled, silence your cell phones. You don't want to be that person whose phone goes off. I have done this numerous times, and it's always extremely embarrassing, including when I've been on stage hosting an event. So don't be like me, silence your cell phone. I want to begin now with 2 authors who are also co-producers of this event and wonderful friends. They've been working tirelessly to put this event together. First of all, Margaret Porter. She's an award-winning and best-selling author of more than 15 works of historical fiction. Margaret's also a former stage actress who worked professionally in film, TV, and radio. Margaret's latest book is called The Myrtle Wand, which we'll talk about in a moment. Margaret, could you come on out, please? Welcome. Also with us is Concord's impresario, can I call him that? Paul Brogan. He is the author of several successful books and the recipient of numerous writing awards, including from the New Hampshire Press Association. Paul hosts the Concord-Area Chats show on Concord TV. His latest book is called A Sprinkling of Stardust Over the Outhouse, and Paul has just been a force of nature when it comes to putting this event together. Paul, please come out and welcome. We will introduce you to 3 other very talented authors from right here in the Concord area, but I'm going to spend a couple minutes with Margaret and Paul just setting the stage, and thanks to you both, first of all, for co-producing this year's event. And from what I understand, when we walked out the door last year, the 2 of you were already putting your heads together to begin organizing and planning for this year. That's dedication. They have spent many, many hours organizing and promoting tonight's program. The Hippo, the Concord Monitor, WKXL. Paul has really put us everywhere, so that's wonderful. Why do you think, both of you, and Margaret, you first, why do you think this is so important to be here once again doing this?
I think that as writers, we're always happy to share about our work, talk about our latest books, the thrill of publication, and to inform people that we have written books. But it's also, I think, important to support other authors and to inspire the community and inform the community about the many people who are writing here in New Hampshire. It's such a supportive landscape, very nurturing to the creative person. It's a wonderful creative economy that's been built up here. So for me, it's personal, but it's also a community effort.
Right, and I'm glad you said that, Margaret, because I think there's so much emphasis now on the creative economy. Bank of New Hampshire Stage, musicians, artists, dancers, but let's add writers. It's a creative process, and it deserves to be recognized, I think, as part of the creative economy.
And also, in the publishing world, the opportunities for marketing and promotion have become very much scaled down, so it's up to the author to promote themselves, and it's also, I think, up to other authors to promote one another.
Oh, that's great. Paul, what do you think? Why is this so important to you? You've spent hours and hours and hours working on this.
I think that, again, like Margaret said, putting the spotlight on some of the outstanding local talent. We've talked before, I know, about people often walk past the local author section of a bookstore thinking, oh, there's nothing really there, or it's only something that would be of local interest. And yet, we write in every kind of genre, and I think that if people stopped and read, you know, the jackets of some of those books, they might be amazed at what is actually there.
At the array of places you go and the themes that you explore, it's not just about, as we were talking on WKXL, it's not just about churning butter during the Revolutionary War, which is interesting. But when you go to those local authors, you find richness everywhere. So, and toward that end, I do want to ask both of you about your books, because their work exemplifies the richness that I'm talking about among local authors. Since we talked last April, both of you have come up with brand new books. Now, Paul, yours is a memoir, and a powerful one at that. So what are some of the main themes that this book raises?
That we're all a lot stronger than we may think, that we can overcome just about any kind of adversity if we really want to, and that we can find joy or surprising delight in things that we never thought we might until we actually try it. And if you don't try something or step out of your comfort zone, then you'll never know what you might have missed out on later on.
Yeah, it's a memoir, and I've called it partly a love letter to Concord, but partly also Paul spent time in Hollywood, so there's a rich contrast there, Paul. Give us a little bit more there.
Well, I think my heart's always belonged here, and I never wanted to, quote, go Hollywood. And I think that the roots you established growing up in Concord, which was the best place you could ever grow up, as far as I'm concerned, are the things that keep you from losing sight of who you really are and what truly matters at the end of the day.
Margaret, your latest, The Myrtle Wand, is historical fiction, and as a Francophile myself, I was thrilled that you set your book in the era of King Louis XIV. Now, the book is based on the classic ballet Giselle, which to me is really interesting. So what gave you the idea, Margaret, to create a whole novel around a ballet?
Well, it took a long time for me to make that decision. And the inspiration of it occurred right here in this building. In January, late January of 2020, I attended the live broadcast from the Bolshoi Ballet in Moscow of Giselle, which was a new production that had restored the original story elements of the ballet, which over the centuries had changed very much, the ending of it and some of the characterizations. And it was interesting to me, this new old version of it was fascinating to me, and I later was able to watch it online, and the pandemic occurred just a few weeks later, and so I was streaming lots of entertainment. I was in the middle of writing another book at that time, which was released later, and had planned to write something else. And then I just thought, I started thinking about the backstory of these characters, the ending, where they came from, and what happened to them before the ballet part, and what happened to them after. And my imagination just went crazy. I put down the project I was going to work on, which I tell people, never do that, finish what you start. I put it down and started writing this book, and it was just, I was on fire. I wrote it in, I think it was 4 months, faster than I've written any novel. The revision took twice as long because I wrote it so fast, of course. But it was just one of those things that just, it was a spark, and I decided to follow my muse, and it was a real joy.
Well, and that's a great story, and even though you and I have talked about this book before, I did not know until now, and Margaret was on my podcast and all this, I did not know that it got its start here.
On that screen behind us, yeah, so, yeah, I feel like I've come a real full circle.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's move into the next portion of our program tonight. So Margaret and Paul are going to help me bring on our next 3 authors. So for a few minutes, Margaret and Paul, I'll hand it over to you. So go ahead, Margaret.
Thanks, Laura. Our first visitor is Dan Lawton, who is a thriller and suspense author. His book, The Greenhouse, won the 2021 New Hampshire Writers Project Literary Award for Fiction, and was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Award for Most Thought-Provoking Book. Dan's written many other novels, including Plum Springs, which won the New Hampshire Writers Project Reader's Choice Award, and Deception, which was named one of the best thriller novels of 2017 by Novel Writing Festival. By day, Dan is a writer and an editor for a private company. Please welcome Dan Lawton.
Kathleen Bailey is a journalist and a novelist with 40 years of experience in the nonfiction, newspaper, and inspirational fields. She's published 5 inspirational fiction books, with a 6th coming out this fall. She's the co-author of 3 nonfiction history books, including her latest called New Hampshire War Monuments, The Stories Behind the Stones. Please welcome Kathleen Bailey.
Crow is the author of the novel The Wrong Kind of Woman. She's a longtime magazine writer and editor, and her nonfiction has run in Literary Hub, Family Circle, Ladies' Home Journal, Parents, Working Mother, The Christian Science Monitor, and Book Page, among others. Her short fiction has won honors from So to Speak, Good Housekeeping, Press 53, New Letters, and Stanford Alumni Magazine, among others. Sarah is a graduate of Dartmouth College, Stanford University, and Vermont College of the Fine Arts, and she's a member of the National Book Critics Circle. Please welcome Sarah McCraw-Crow.
Wonderful. I love having the stage kind of crowded with Concord-Area authors. This is great. And I want to hear from all of you on this question, but Sarah, I'm going to turn to you first. Writing at the level where all 3 of you are at, with published books, is not an easy path. Publishing is a very difficult industry. Sarah, what's your mindset when you head to that desk to do your writing about why you're doing it and how you feel about it?
Well, one of the paradoxes, I would say, of publishing a novel, not just writing but publishing, is you start to know a lot more about the book business, about sales and marketing and publishing, And weirdly, that can get in the way of your writing and actually unleash your, I guess, inner critic. And so and I'm sure a lot of other writers do this, I have these tricks that kind of let me feel like more of a beginner, or the stakes are lower and it doesn't matter. So that's stuff like writing in a notebook by hand, or writing first thing in the morning when my brain is still kind of fuzzy before I connect to social media. Taking a long walk and just letting my mind wander and taking notes, or even doing like a Zoom writing session. You know, just different things to get out of one mindset and then back into the other, like the mindset of the process and not the outcome.
Oh, that's interesting. So you said that when you write a novel and your goal is to get the novel published, you start learning about the book business, and you kind of have that looming over you or on your shoulder while you're writing, which I'm taking isn't good.
It can be good. It might give you structure. It might give you another deadline to work towards, but it can also be, you know about other people who are selling more books or whatever. So it's a little bit of a, I don't think writers know to expect that before they publish a book.
Right.
It can be helpful and it can be not helpful.
So when you get up, Sarah, and you go to that desk to do it, do you feel compelled to do it? Because a lot of writers I've talked to say, I have to do this. It's like a painter has to paint, a writer has to write.
Well, I think there's a discomfort when you don't write. There's kind of a not good feeling. I'm sure you guys know that. When you don't write. But there's also that feeling of like, it's not fear exactly, but it can be like, so you have to like find tricks to go around that, I think.
What do you think, Kathleen, when you go to that desk, how do you describe your mindset when you sit down to do it?
My mindset is to make sense of whatever material I have.
That's the journalist mindset, yeah.
Yes, when I was a journalist, I spent a lot of time covering selectmen's meetings, planning board, and I may not have been the greatest investigative journalist, but boy, nobody could explain a water rate hike like I could. Nobody could read a town working budget or a school district budget like me, and I felt that I was responsible for breaking it down for my people and making sense of it for them. And that carried over to my nonfiction book writing. I love to take a mass of material, research, bad note-taking, whatever, and codify it and make it into something people would actually like to read.
Right, and as a journalist myself, I completely get that, and that's a skill. So when you approach that writing, you feel the task is before you and you're excited to do it.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same for my fiction too, only there I'm working with human emotions and things like the lie that they tell themselves. So I have to take that massive material and make sense out of it.
Yeah, maybe a little bit later we can talk about writing fiction versus nonfiction, because that's tougher to untangle than the water bill, believe it or not, right? Like, why do people lie to themselves? How about you, Dan? How do you feel about approaching your desk and writing? You're a busy guy, you've got a family, you've got a job, and yet Dan's written, I don't know, 8, 9 books. So how do you feel when you sort of sit down to do it?
Yeah, for me, what Sarah said hits it right on the head. When I'm not writing, it feels like something is missing. And so there's parts of the year when I'm not actively writing, whether it's in between novels or during revision times, but I like to call it the itch. And so at certain points of the year, it could be the fall, it could be the spring, I'll get the itch. And it's the stories inside of me ready to come out. And so I love it. I do feel like I have to do it. It's a way to express myself. I read a lot and consume a lot of films, and so I'm always finding ideas, and so it's ingrained in my body.
Yeah, and I love what you said, because that relates to, I strongly feel that writers should be considered creators and should be part of the creative economy. So what you said is just like a dancer or a singer, you have to do it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
I want to ask all three of you about the kind of books that you write, and Kathleen, to you first. So you said after a career in journalism, you began writing fiction, you published a couple books, but now here you are writing nonfiction, again this time, so coming full circle. You're writing local history books. You've got one about Exeter, and we've got the New Hampshire War Monuments, we've got the forthcoming growing up in Concord. So you kind of come full circle. So what pulled you back into nonfiction, Kathleen?
I was looking for a project to do with my daughter Sheila, who's a talented photographer. And I knew about Arcadia Publishing. So I approached them. Ironically, War Monuments was the first idea I had for a nonfiction book. But when I approached Arcadia, they said, well, we're really looking for someone to do something on Exeter. And I live in Raymond, so I've been going to Exeter all my adult life. So we took the bit and we did the Exeter book, and that was great fun. That was mostly a photo book. We had to contrast vintage and antique images with what's on the spot today. So it was a lot of running around and taking pictures, hanging from 3-story windows to get the right angle. Great fun. But the writing part was just a paragraph between the two photos. It was kind of like a paint-by-number project.
Oh, I see.
And then I was finally allowed to do War Monuments, and I fell in love with nonfiction writing. Telling real people's stories is as good as it gets.
Especially some of the stories that you tell in War Monuments of the people who went off to war and never came back, and there's some heartbreaking stories in there. And
Yeah, the people and the monuments.
right.
For example, I challenge anybody to read the story behind the Buddy Monument in Jaffrey and not burst into tears.
The Stories Behind the Stones is the subtitle. So, Sarah, you write historical fiction. Your debut novel takes place in the early 1970s, not an era often examined by historical fiction. So what drew you to this time period, more recent history?
Well, I mean, I don't exactly think of myself as a historical fiction writer, but it turns out I guess I am. But I just have a lot of affection for the early 70s and for the pop culture and music of the 70s. But also, the 70s were a time of a lot of change. And it was change that started in the 60s and kind of came to fruition, if it was going to, or at least became more well-known in the 70s. And that was something I've been curious about for a long time. And I guess closer to home, I have wondered about the schools, like Dartmouth College, because The Wrong Kind of Woman is sort of a campus novel set around a fictional college in New Hampshire. But I have wondered about those schools that really resisted admitting women and people of color for many, many years. And that was just sort of in the back of my mind, percolating for a long time. And those two things sort of came together, I guess. And yeah, and then thinking about the women of our parents' generation, what life was like for them when they were young and how they coped with fewer opportunities, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I read your book, you know, people think the 60s get all the sort of credit, don't they? You know, but when I read your book, I realized, there was a lot going on in the 70s. So I did want to ask quickly about your newest books before we go to our audience. So I hope you have questions ready, because we do want to hear from you very soon. But your latest book, so Dan, you write thrillers with some romance woven in. So before we talk about The Greenhouse, sort of where do you get those threads of ideas?
Yeah, it all goes back to what I like to read. And so I think it's important to write what you enjoy reading. And so I enjoyed the thrills, the excitement, with a little emotion mixed in. And so that's where it comes from for me.
So The Greenhouse, if I'm browsing the shelves at Gibson's or I'm at Concord Public Library and I pull your book off and I say, this looks interesting, what is the book jacket going to tell me, Dan?
So it's a little bit different than my other novels. There is still a lot of suspense in it, though, which is important for me. So what you will learn is that Gerard Remington, he's a fragile older gentleman who's been through a lot in his life, and there was a tragedy about 4 decades prior that really shaped who he was, and it was with him for the 40 years. Present day, another tragedy happens, this time to his wife, and he begins to spiral. And so it digs into mental health. He has a lot of trouble with depression. Where the greenhouse comes in is there's 7 flowers, which have 7 colors. They all mean different things. You know, there's a lot of symbolism in there with I might be biased, but I think there's an explosive twist at the end, which wraps it all together.
Which we will not ask you to reveal now, of course.
Right.
Yeah, so sort of 7 flowers, kind of unpacking it bit by bit, and
Yes.
a lot of people can probably relate to the idea of nature and the greenhouse as a way of healing as well.
Yeah, and so what's interesting, the title itself is a bit of a metaphor in that it's the greenhouse, 2 words, greenhouse, when in fact it is a greenhouse as in the agricultural structure, but it's also green. And then the color of green is important as well. And so it's all woven in together. There are no mistakes.
Intriguing. And BTW, it's for sale out in the lobby. Isn't that amazing? Kathleen, the title of your book, New Hampshire War Monuments, The Stories Behind the Stones, a little more obvious about what the book is about, but what approach did you and your daughter try and take with this book?
Well, we analyzed it by each war, and I would use either historical photographs of the monuments, or Sheila would take a contemporary photo, depending on what the story called for. We looked at each war from the Revolution to Afghanistan, and we talked about, basically it's a history of war in New Hampshire, told through its monuments. We talked about the stories behind the monuments. We talked about how New Hampshire responded in war. There's a really sweet story in there about Franklin, where Jed Barker left Franklin when he was 6 years old. And he moved to Paramus, New Jersey. He died in Vietnam. And Franklin still put up a memorial to him.
Even though he hadn't been there till he was
set foot in the
6.
town
Yeah.
since he was 6.
That says something,
That's
doesn't
New
it?
Hampshire.
Right, right.
So I fell in love with real people's stories. I fell in love with New Hampshire all over again.
Yeah.
And one of the things we looked at was how the character and tone of the monuments changed over the life of our state.
From the point of, you know, the old-fashioned monument where you have a guy on a horse to having a 5K road race
That's
honoring this
right,
person.
that's
So
right.
the whole philosophy of how we honor and
Yeah,
remember
like Dan
had
Healy of
changed.
Exeter has a
Yeah.
road race. Doug of Plymouth has a camp scholarship, and they
Right.
fund it with golf tournaments.
Yeah, so things have definitely changed from that sort of
Yeah, it's something
guy on a
that,
horse in the middle of the central square.
it's something that they would have liked.
Right, they would
They
have
would.
enjoyed that. Sarah, to you, you gave us a little teaser, but give us a little bit more. So I'm pulling your book off the shelf at the library, and what does the book jacket tell me about it?
Well, you can tell by the paperback cover, you can tell it's probably set in the 70s because the color palette is avocado green and yellow. But it doesn't tell you that it's mostly a campus novel, a different sort of campus novel. I mean, it definitely tells you that there is a woman who's the main character. So yeah, I mean, it's really a story about 3 people who are grieving the same person and grappling with that death. And that person is Oliver, who was a professor at this small all-male college. But it's also a story of friendship and finding your true self at different ages. It might be midlife, or for the other 2 characters, one is 20 and one is 13. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me how these 2 female characters were trying to find themselves in the wake of a death, and one is a teenager, so she's obviously trying to find herself. But within the stricter moral codes of the 70s, you know, women don't do that, girls don't do that. So I thought that was really interesting.
But a time when things were changing.
Yes.
It was just slow to hit this little town.
Right, right. And Sarah actually went to Dartmouth College about a decade after it started admitting women, so that's an interesting point that a lot of people didn't realize until 1971.
72. I think.
72, Dartmouth was all male, so that's an interesting backdrop for Sarah's book. I do want to go to our audience now, because again, I remember being wowed by the questions last year. So when the mic comes to you, you can give us your name and where you're from if you'd like. No pressure, but if you'd like to give us your name and where you're from, that's great. Also, if your question is for our panel in general, or if you have a specific question for one of our authors. Last thing, please let our microphone helpers hang on to the microphone. Concord TV is recording, so for audio purposes and also for sanitary purposes, you know, we really don't want to share the microphone among 120 people. So please let our microphone helpers hold on to the microphone. And Kara is over there, and Louise is over there. So who wants to break the ice and ask a question for our wonderful authors? Yeah, here's someone right there. Oh, hi, Mary. It's hard with the lights.
Hi, Laura. Thank you all for hosting this event. You were just asking Sarah a question about when I pick your book off of a library shelf, and I wonder about your successes and lack of successes in New Hampshire libraries and beyond, getting your books on the shelf, and the role of the state library. And I believe the Center for the Book has maybe been not as well funded as it used to be, and if you've had any interactions with that. Thank you.
So Mary, getting your book on library shelves, never mind bookstore shelves, but library shelves. Wow, that's a great question. Anybody have any thoughts, experience on that? Margaret?
I make sure that part of my promotional campaign is to send a postcard or a sell sheet or something to the libraries around the state. And the Center for the Book has featured probably most of our books as a book of the month or a book of the week or something. Yes. So we do get support that way. And we are available to libraries to do talks and to meet with either book clubs or just to do book events with groups of authors or individually. I know I used to live in Epsom, and even since moving to Concord, I go out to Epsom and we'll do events at that library as well, and others. So we are very grateful to libraries. Every time we go to a library, we check whether it's our local library or a different library, we check the shelves to see if our titles are there, or if they're checked out. You can tell online if a book is checked out. And there's also WorldCat, which covers all the libraries around the country, and you can see what libraries your books might be in, and if you can do a mailing to a library and ask them to carry your book, especially if it's regional or it has some kind of connection to that community.
Yeah. And Mary Cronenwetter, and Mary was on my podcast very early on, and I'm so embarrassed, Mary, because I've been focusing on these folks. Give us the name of your book, because I forget, and I read it, and it's great.
I'm sure almost everyone in this audience, I'm sure, has books, but my book's name is Paparazzi.
Paparazzi, yes, and it's historical fiction. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for being here, Mary. Who wants to go next? Another question from the audience about books, writing, the writing climate here in New Hampshire. Someone sitting next to Mary. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Louise.
Are any of you self-published?
Good question. Now, Dan, when we talked, you said your first two books were self-published. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, my first two novels, I decided to self-publish them. So for the first one, I went through the queer reading trenches and had a bite with an agent. It didn't go anywhere, and so I was anxious to get it out there. And so I self-published, and I enjoyed the process, so I did it again. And then I stopped enjoying the process. And so since then, my future novels have been published by someone other than myself.
So you had two self-published novels, is that right?
Correct.
Why did you first enjoy it and then not enjoy it?
The enjoy part was learning the industry. You get to learn everything from distribution to formatting expectations, and really get to learn the industry inside and out. And as a newbie, it was a great experience. And then when I did it twice, I was like, well, it's a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so I would rather focus more on the writing as opposed to the rest of it.
Do you think the self-publishing that you did, and at least getting those two books like out in the world, do you think that helped you once you went back the third time and tried to look for a traditional agent and a traditional publisher?
It did, yeah. So it depends on the person. If the books don't do well, then it's not really going to do much for you. for me, it ended up helping getting, it was a smallish publisher, but they liked the experience of having other books out there. And so in my particular case, it was an advantage.
Any other thoughts from the panel on self-publishing? Because this is a question a lot of people have, given that there are so many opportunities to self-publish now. Anyone else want to talk about the route that they took or why they chose to stay with traditional or self-publishing? Yeah, Kathleen, go ahead.
Self-publishing has changed in the past 20 to 30 years.
Right, even in the past couple years, I think, yeah.
And indie publishing is very respectable and respected, even though it wasn't for a while. It was all old ladies writing poems about their cats.
Kathleen, for the audience, tell people what independent publishing is, because some people know, but some people don't. Yes, that's an important point.
Independent publishing is the new cool name for self-publishing, and it's a very respectable form of publishing because the big major publishing houses are tightening their lists and they have editors' heads on the chopping block, as it were. The economy has changed. COVID has affected the publishing industry. If I had a book that I didn't think would fit with either of my two publishers, I would definitely go indie.
Yeah.
There are so many options open for writers today.
Well, I'm going to shelve that cat project, so. But Paul, now you have your two books with a small publisher. You're not self-published, but you have a small publisher. So can you talk a little bit about that experience, working with a small publisher?
The first two I went with an outside publisher, and they were small and they were willing to give it attention.
Yeah.
But the first book I was very disappointed in because it was supposed to come out in December of 2011, and the first day of April, I thought it was an April Fool joke, they said, oh no, we're going to bring it out next month in May. So there was not the time to do some of the things that I wanted to do with it. And so I was never totally satisfied, and that was that a name I dropped. With the Concord Theater book, I went with a small New Hampshire publisher, and it was a great experience in every way. For the third book, I did go the self-published route deliberately because I wanted more control over it, and I wanted it to be what I wanted it to be and not to have regrets down the road. And I found it to be a great experience. They could not have been nicer. They treated me terrifically and passed everything by me, took my suggestions and allowed my partner to design the book cover so that it was what I wanted it to be, and it worked out beautifully with that. The next book, I'm going with a traditional publisher because I had offers, but the self-publish, which is no longer Vanity Press, which is what it used to be.
The cat poetry.
Was a tremendously satisfying experience, and it's done very, very well, and the comments I've received from people have been very positive.
Well, it's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you asked it. And if I could do a little plug for the 603 Writers Conference, which is coming up on June 3rd, 603, get it? I'm going to be moderating a panel on this whole publishing question, so more on that in June. So anyone else with questions, don't be shy. It's a friendly crowd. Anyone else? Oh, bunch of people. Over here, maybe, Kara? Yeah.
At this point, I don't know what I don't know. I am a writer. I am doing KDP, if I can say that out loud. And I have...
Can you say that again? I didn't catch the second sentence there. Yeah.
KDP, Kindle Publishing.
Direct publishing.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. And it's a romance novel with a little twist at the end, like Dan said he has. And it's great, but the process is unbelievable, like everybody is saying, and learning the whole process. And marketing is going to be difficult, so I'll be back. And
Yeah.
book.
Great.
I would like to be where each one of these people are and few months, days.
Well, keep going. Keep going. Yeah. It's hard. I mean, Sarah, you and I have talked about this. It's not easy. It's a long process, and there's a lot of, you know.
If you choose to go the traditional route, the process, as Dan has done, and it's, you are querying agents, it can take months, it can take years for some people. It's a slow process. And yeah.
Other questions? I saw a couple hands over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Talk about perseverance when you're discouraged.
Oh, yes, Margaret. Perseverance when you're discouraged. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Because after 15 novels, you think I've got perseverance? Oh my goodness. Well, it's hard. I think the discouraging part is very much self-inflicted, and you have to know what your strengths are, and you have to really focus on those. And I think that the writing itself, everyone has their own different best times to write, best moods to write in. I think self-study is really important. Motivation, there are all kinds of motivation. The motivation to get to the end of the next chapter, the motivation to get to the end of the next book, the motivation to send out 15 query letters to an agent when you've got a completed manuscript. The perseverance comes in also when you get the responses. Sometimes there are responses that we've read your book and it doesn't fit our list, which is just kind of a generic thing that you sort of don't know how to analyze. What does that mean? This other person I know wrote a book that's not that different from mine, and yet you didn't want mine. It's a very time-consuming process, and you just have to have really good, I think it's important to have good support structures in your life. Have a cheerleader somewhere, a spouse or a friend or another writer in particular, I think is just really crucial to having that kind of motivation. And sometimes having the accountability, like having someone that you tell, okay, I'm going to finish chapter whatever it is by the end of however many days, and keep me honest, and I'm going to ask me when I'm finished, and that sort of thing, I think is one way to do it. Other people on the panel may have different ways to deal with it.
It's a great question.
It is a very good question.
It is a great question because it's hard to write, and then you're revising, and then someone says, I don't like it, start over. Perseverance, Dan? Do you have any perseverance secrets?
I don't know if there's secrets, but there's something called imposter syndrome where you question if what you're doing is any good. And so this is something that I think probably every one of us has experienced at some point, where you'll write something, you think it's excellent, and then maybe the next day you'll read it and either be disgusted with yourself or discouraged. I think also every other writer experiences rejection as well. And so it is difficult at first when you spend hours working to query someone, and then sometimes a response can come in 30 seconds with a generic no.
Yeah.
It's tough, but eventually you get used to it.
Yeah.
And it just takes one yes. So that's been the driver for me. And so far it's worked out.
Well, speaking of imposter syndrome, now Sarah, you told me that you started writing, in midlife. You haven't always been writing since you were, 20 years old. So did you, starting off this career as a fiction writer in midlife, think, well, who am I doing this? Did you have some of that?
Yeah, I definitely had thoughts of maybe I'm too old, or I'm not a real writer, because I do think there is a narrative out there that the real writers have their first novel published in their 20s or maybe their early 30s, and if you haven't done that, well, maybe don't bother. But also this sort of relates back to the perseverance question, because I didn't get serious about fiction until I was about 40, even though I've written for my whole career. I've written magazine stuff and nonfiction, and it took me about 10 years to get an agent, and I had written probably 3 practice novels by that point, and then another 5 to get my book published. But in that time, there were other people that I'd started with, and they had stopped writing. So there's just the issue of if you keep at it, you obviously increase your chances of succeeding.
And you also get better. You learn.
And you get better.
You learn what, as I said, what your strengths are, and you become more comfortable with your own process.
I want to ask our panelists a couple more questions, and then I want to definitely go back to the audience. But here we are, sitting here in Concord, New Hampshire, the capital city of a state that has a long, long tradition of generating writers and poets. And Kathleen, to you, what are the inspirations for you being an author here in New Hampshire?
Well, I can't point to any particular time or place where I knew that this was a mecca for authors or a petri dish for authors or whatever, because we've always had it. I grew up around it. Dartmouth professors wrote books. I went to UNH. The professors at UNH were writing books like they were eating candy. Phillips Exeter Academy, spawning books about it, or graduates writing books. The McDowell Colony in Peterborough, Dan freaking Brown, Joyce Maynard, Tommy DiPiola. People who like to write move here.
Something in the water, like we said last time around.
We've just always had
John Irving and Jodi Picoult, Janet Ivanovich, Thornton Wilder. I mean, there is something here that does support writers. I wonder, Paul, do you want to weigh in on that? The sort of ecosystem for writers, either in Concord or in New Hampshire?
Well, at Bishop Brady, we had an incredible English teacher, Harvey Smith, who really encouraged us to read local authors at the time. This was more than 50 years ago, but he told us that, you know, not to just read Jacqueline Suzanne, who was very big at the time, and things like that, but to start reading some of the talent right here in the state. And we did, and we would discuss that in class, and it was incredibly invigorating and stimulating when you're a junior in high school to know that you are surrounded. Even we talked about Grace Metalios, even though her books at the time were scandalous, and at a Catholic high school you barely whispered the name, but she was a very successful novelist from New Hampshire. And so it was just, you never doubted that there was this enormous pool of talent here.
Right. Yeah, I should have had Grace Metalios on that list I just read, because that book, as scandalous as it was at the time, is an incredibly well-written book. Go ahead, Margaret. Yeah.
I think a huge part of it is the reading audience, the reading community, and the passion for reading. Almost everyone I know is in, or every other person I know is in a reading group or a book club or something like that, and that literate population, I think, makes it, the more people read, sometimes the more they want to be a writer as well. I think there might be a connection there.
Right. Well, members of my book club are here. You know who you are. So you're right. A lot of people are in book clubs and reading clubs. I'd like to ask a couple more audience questions before we sort of do some final questions, and there are a couple other authors in the audience that I want to acknowledge, but I'd love to get a couple more audience questions. Anything is fine, writing, publishing, the process, where our writers get their ideas. All questions are welcome. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
It's ma'am, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see back there, I apologize.
That's okay. My question concerns a workshop I attended last week at the New Hampshire Writers Project regarding audiobooks.
Oh.
So my question for the panel is whether you have audiobooks, and if not, if that's something you'll consider in the future, given the huge increase in audio listeners.
Oh, that's a great question. I think New Hampshire Writers Project had a seminar on that just this past week, Mushery, right? Yeah. I'll go down the line here. Do you have audiobooks available of your books?
Yes, all of them are audiobooks. And so the last 4 with the current publisher, they produced those, they've hired the narrator. It's been successful, and so what I was able to do with a couple of my other smaller publishers was get the rights back. the audio rights to my books, and then I ended up hiring that same narrator who's done the last 4, and so now there's 8 audiobooks.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's a process that you would recommend people do because of the popularity that you mentioned. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, it is a bit untapped. There's not nearly as many audiobooks as there are physical books, and so it's a growing market. I do recommend, yes.
Kathleen, your books are a little more picture-based, so I'm wondering if audiobooks would work for your, for more.
I'll pass on this one.
Yeah, okay. Sarah.
Yeah, my book has an audiobook, and the publisher produced it and picked a few narrators for me. I mean, I had a little bit of say, like I could pick my favorite of the 3 that they had chosen, although that was hard because they all sounded good, and I mean, I think they all would have been great.
So you were happy with that process?
Yeah, I'm glad it exists. And
right.
I mean, one thing about audiobooks, if you're not getting them from the library, they are pretty expensive. I mean, I guess if you're doing Audible or Libro FM, you have a subscription, and that helps a little bit.
Right.
But yeah, I'm a fan of audiobooks.
Right, and people travel long distances, or you do it while you're mowing the lawn or whatever. Go ahead, Margaret. Audiobooks.
Yes, I have one title that's out in audio. Most of my novels are set in England or Europe or Ireland, and getting the voices right is really important to me, but for a book that was totally US based, I have an audiobook for that. And I have the audio rights to all my backlist and the one that was produced, I chose the person who did the narration, star of Broadway. I mean, it was really exciting. And I'm personally not an audiobook listener, so the first audiobook I actually listened to was my own when the files were coming. It was really interesting, because they always say you should read your own work aloud or have someone read it to you or something, and it was most enjoyable. But during the pandemic, the audiobook business just absolutely boomed, and so I think if I could find the right voices, since I do have the rights to my backlist, that I would probably pursue that.
Which book is there available in audio form?
It's The Limits of Limelight, which I think is going to be on sale in the lobby.
Right.
The one about Ginger Rogers and her cousin Phyllis Fraser.
So the most recent one takes place in France 300 or 400 years ago. Well, that's a little trickier, isn't it?
Yes, and then the Hedy Lamarr novel, she was Austrian from Vienna, and that would, it just had to be right, and I was reluctant to pursue that at that time, but it's probably worth doing.
Paul, audiobooks? I love the question, thank you.
No, the first one was at a name I dropped. They did a test and a sample for me, and I hated it. I said, God, they've turned the words I wrote into something absolutely horrible. So I said no. But for the upcoming 4th book, which is a mystery, I plan to definitely pursue that.
Oh, so what was it that's a strong reaction. What was it that you didn't like so much?
I guess I didn't like hearing my words spoken by the person that they chose to speak them. Mm-hmm. It just, I said, the book was 745 pages, and I said, I wouldn't listen to 7 pages with that voice. I should have 745.
Paul, you're a broadcaster, you've been an actor, you should have been voicing it yourself.
I know. Especially a memoir. It'd be very hard to have someone else read your memoir. Other questions from the audience? We have time for 1 or 2 more. Any other questions? Yeah, down here.
So the answer to my question might have been audiobooks, but my question is sort of a comment. My son, 18-year-old son, tells me that nobody reads anymore, and so I'd just like to get your feedback on that commentary.
That is a great question. And I have 2 sons, 23 and 19, and sadly, I think you're not nobody, but definitely younger generations, I don't think read as much as we did. That is thorny, and I'm really glad you raised it. Anyone? Dan?
Yes, so I will speak for the 30-somethings. I think more of them read than people are aware of. I know almost everybody I know reads in some form. A lot of it's audiobooks. I think book sales in general are up year over year, and so people are reading. 30-somethings are part of that group as well. I can't speak for the 20-somethings though.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, Dan, if they're reading, but they're reading on their phones.
For sure.
So,
yep.
you know.
Yeah, with e-readers, those
certainly
count. There's just different.
Right.
Yep.
Young adult books are that's a very dedicated reading population.
Yes.
They like print books, which it always surprises me, but when I read Publishers Weekly or things and they talk about or studies of who's reading what and what formats they like, it's really interesting to me that age group is really into print.
Right.
Which is great. We like all formats. We like having print books and audiobooks and ebooks, and but it's just there are more options now.
Yeah. Sarah, you have young adult children. What are your thoughts on their reading habits?
Our kids are big readers, and I'm not sure why. They mostly read print books too. But I mean, one thing I do know, speaking of Publishers Weekly, like TikTok, which probably none of us use, and Book Talk moves millions of books. I mean, that has changed the whole book industry, and the people who are using TikTok are young. So if you put that together, maybe young people are actually reading.
Ah, that's interesting.
So,
okay.
I hope.
Well, and I was at the hairdresser's today because I'm here tonight. And all the other people in the salon must have been, 23 to 26, and they were all gushing about this one book series that they were all reading. And so maybe there's some hope there. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from there. Before I ask our guests on stage a couple more last questions, I do want to acknowledge another special group of authors that is with us tonight. We did not have enough room on stage to fit all the talent that is right here in the Concord area, but I do want to acknowledge them. So when I read your name, if you could stand up and face the audience so they get to know you and hold up one or more of your books. First, we have Masherie Chappelle. Masherie is the New Hampshire Writers Project Board Trustee Chair, a Smith Scholar graduate of Smith College. She received a BA in Theater and Creative Writing. There's the theater back. She's an award-winning author, playwright, professional story guide. Her novel, The Oracle Files Escape, won the 2019 New Hampshire Literary Award for Outstanding Work of Fiction. She uses her experiences as an intuitive and medium in her stories, which are published under her independent imprint, Portal Star Publishing. Again, Masherie is the tireless force behind the New Hampshire Writers Project. So big round of applause for Masherie. Next up, we have Dan Cesny. Dan. Author and journalist of travel memoir, fiction, and poetry, including The White Mountain, Rediscovering Mount Washington's Hidden Culture, which he was on the exchange with me many years ago talking about that, which won the 2019 New Hampshire Writers Project Award for Outstanding Nonfiction and the Nonfiction People's Choice Award. Dan and his young daughter collaborated on the field guide, New Hampshire Rocks That Rock, an adventure guide to 25 famous boulders in the Granite State. Dan is also the associate publisher of The Hippo. When do you sleep, Dan? And he's the director of the Griffin Free Public Library in Auburn. Wow, Dan, thank you so much for being here. Great. Also with us is Marjorie Burke. Go ahead, Marjorie. Marjorie and her beloved husband, Donald, worked together on the book Melting Ice, Shifting Sand. The first 6 years of Donald's struggle with Alzheimer's, and then Marjorie completed a trilogy with 2 subsequent titles, Pilgrimage on Ice and Sand and Beyond Ice and Sand. She also wrote a collection of poems and meditation on grieving called When Will Someday Come. Marjorie's poetry and prose have been published in literary magazines and local newspapers. Congratulations, Marjorie. Thank you for being here. Last but certainly not least, we have Dan Pouliot. Dan earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts from UNH, and his digital works can be found in multiple collections around the state. Dan's debut young adult novel is called Superhuman, a release from Musheries Portal Star Publishing. Now, Dan describes Superhuman Book 1 as The Karate Kid Meets Escape to Witch Mountain. Dan is vice chair of the New Hampshire Writers Project, one of our event sponsors. Professionally, Dan works in marketing and web development. Dan, thank you so much. And just a couple last wrap-up questions for our guests on stage, and I'm going to go right down the line with you. What is your best 30-second advice for aspiring writers? And Dan, you go first.
I will not need 30 seconds. It is very short. If you want to be a writer, I say just write.
He makes it sound so easy. Kathleen, go ahead.
Learn to take criticism. I could have shaved 20 years off my journey to publication if I had listened to what other people were saying.
Great. Sarah?
Agree with both of those. I would add, read a lot. Read the books you love already, and think about what it is that calls to you about them, and read in your genre and outside your genre. But remember that those books do not compare your messy draft to those books, because those books have had many eyes on them, and those books are finished. So, but do read a lot.
Yeah. Margaret, best 30-second advice for aspiring writers?
Persevere, for number one. Develop patience, number two. And as I said before, find your support system, find the people who can keep you going on the days when it seems like you just can't do it again. And also, I would say, this is hard advice to give because I admitted earlier that I stopped writing a book to write another book. But generally, I tell people when I do workshops is to finish what you start. And also to, if you read within your genre, if you read the kind of books that you truly love, those are the books that you should be writing. Don't write to the market or whatever you think is hot, unless it's something that you absolutely love and you think that you have a new way of expressing what's really popular in your own vein. And I think also make sure that as you're creating, if you're a novelist, I'm talking from a novelist perspective, to make sure that you have plot and characters that you can sustain for hundreds of pages and thousands of words.
And Paul, best advice?
Hey, great advice from everyone on the panel, and I would add to that, certainly about being true to yourself, but also you're never too old to start writing. My first book wasn't published till I was after 55. And so you don't say to yourself, oh, I'm this age and I can't do it. Because you can if you really want to.
Yeah, you could live to 100 and then you'd be mad that you didn't, that you thought you were old at 55. So
you'd have a lot more stories to tell too.
Exactly, exactly. There's a richness to being a mature writer. Absolutely. Kathleen, yeah, go ahead.
I was 69 when my first book was published.
There you go. That's awesome. I'm glad you added that. Last question, I'm going to go down the line this way. I know all of you are working on that next project, so give us a little taste of what that's going to be, and I'll go down this way. Paul, go ahead.
It's called The Park. It's set in Concord in 1962 during the Peanut Carnival. It's a murder mystery. It's a fiction, but there are real-life people involved in it.
Murder at the Peanut Carnival, that sounds...
In White's Park.
Yes, where I live quite close,
yes.
So. Margaret, your next project.
Well, after 15 historical novels, I decided to venture into contemporary fiction and to return to my earlier roots, which began in historical romance. So it's a contemporary novel, but it's a relationship story with a romantic element, and hope that it will be available sometime in 2024, and I'm currently working on the sequel to that, and I have 2 further historical biographical novels in the pipeline, on the back burner.
Wow.
So I'm persevering.
Yes, that's great. Sarah, how about you, your next project? I know you've got something on the stove.
It's another novel, and it is a family story set in the 80s, So in terms of my progress, moving forward a decade.
A family story set in the 80s. Okay, and I know I'm going to love that because that's the best music.
Yeah. And so far there's a lot of music in it. So.
Kathleen, you've got something coming very soon, I think.
Growing up in Concord, New Hampshire in the 50s and 60s, boomer memories from White's Park to the Capitol Theater.
Oh, it's great. And I think we have, that's right up there, right? Okay.
Paul's in it.
Okay.
I interviewed 30 to 50 Concord kids from that period, and I believe Paul was one of them.
Okay.
You were one of them, weren't you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. And Dan, I know you have something coming too, which sounds really exciting, so go ahead.
I do, yes. So since the greenhouse, I have written a 3-book series, which is a first for me. All my other books are standalones. And so the third and final book will be out the end of next month. To give you a bit of a sneak peek, the first chapter of the first book starts with a middle-aged man going through a midlife crisis. He's going through a divorce. He walks into a supermarket where there's a younger woman who he's very attracted to, and he works up the courage to ask her number, and she gives it to him. He walks out of the supermarket, high on life, and the supermarket explodes behind him. And so that's
Write fast.
Yep.
Wow. Well, if tonight has inspired you to start writing or to continue your writing, we encourage you to attend the upcoming New Hampshire Writers Project Annual 603 Conference. It's in June, as I said earlier, on June 3rd, so the date is easy to remember, 603. I'll be there. I'll be moderating a panel on getting published. Margaret and Paul are going to be workshop presenters. You can find out more about the 603 conference and the New Hampshire Writers Project out in the lobby. There are brochures about the project, and then you can just go to the project website and sign up for the conference. And so I really hope to see everybody in this audience in June. I do want to thank our sponsors. Without them, we would not be sitting here tonight. Gibson's Bookstore, the New Hampshire Writers Project, Concord Public Library, Concord TV, and especially Steve Dupree and the Dupree Companies for their financial support. Now lastly, while the conversation part of our evening is done, the fun is not over. We invite you to join us in the lobby now, where our authors are going to be signing copies of our books. Now, Concord has a reputation for being an early town. So, let's defy that reputation. Go to the bar, go have some books, chat with the authors, mingle, enjoy yourselves, and see if you can make it till 9:30. What do you think?